Between vanishing coastlines, prolonged periods of drought, and increasingly intense hurricanes, lives and livelihoods in small island states are under constant threat. Even if we manage to keep the temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, the global climate crisis has made it so that island life as we know it will never be the same again. So, how do we survive? We must adapt. My name is Andy Liebert, and this is Islands on Alert, a podcast where we discuss how climate change has already affected our islands, what's in store for us if the Earth continues to warm, and how we can help to reduce the devastating impacts. Now, some say that there are three possible responses to climate change: mitigation, suffering, and adaptation. Now, as we heard from Dr. Thomas, we are already feeling the repercussions of climate change. Hurricanes are strong, and they will get even stronger. From Stanley and Arietta, we've heard some possible mitigation tactics like renewable energy that we can adopt to reduce future suffering. Today, we'll talk about that last response, adaptation. Adaptation is a response of the most critical importance for us in small island states. We are far more prone to climate change relative to our negligible contribution to the problem. Today, we'll be looking at how we can use both traditional knowledge and modern technology to physically, socially, and culturally adapt to the effects of climate change. Our first guest today is from the beautiful island of Barbados. Dr. Brewster is the director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit, CZMU. Now, alongside the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy, the CZMU is working to, and we quote here, embrace climate resilience and disaster risk in coastal management plans.
Morning to everyone. Thanks for having me.
Now, welcome, Dr. Brewster. And first off, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your home, Barbados?
Okay, we're a small island state in the Caribbean. We're about 166 square miles or 432 square kilometers. We have lovely coastlines mainly made of coral sand beaches, and we're very flat in comparison to much of the other Caribbean islands by nature. We're predominantly a coral limestone island, and we sit off of the island chain, more so in the Atlantic Ocean, but still close enough to be considered to be part of the Caribbean chain itself.
Now, you are the director of the Coastal Zone Management Unit. What exactly is a coastal management plan, and why is it necessary?
Okay, so the Coastal Zone Management Unit is a specialized agency within the government structure of Barbados, where we really focus on the shoreline stabilization and enhancement for the coastline. As a small organization, we are science-led, so we spend a lot of time and research looking at matters that speak to the coastline. So we are consulted on all coastal development applications for physical infrastructure development. We do ecosystem monitoring. We also do public education and awareness. We also look at matters that speak to coastal engineering designs for coastal structures, etc. And we have also implemented our own internal coastal projects for the last 35 years or so as part of a Barbados Coastal Conservation Program that we've gotten funding through from the Inter-American Development Bank. We try to ensure that in all that we do, there is an ecosystem-based approach to what we do, but we do also recognize that development is a serious concern, especially as a small island state that is heavily dependent on tourism. So we have to try and manage where we can the type of development that's taking place and the potential impact that could have on a coastline. In 1998, we developed a comprehensive integrated coastal zone management plan that clearly spoke to some of the issues that were affecting the coastline, stuff like that speaks to water quality analysis, the need for improved ecosystem restoration incentives, dealing with matters that spoke to the greater use of setbacks for planning applications, etc., along the way, as well as identifying areas that would require additional shoreline stabilization enhancement approaches to ensure generational and transformative coastal management along the way. Since then, we've now just concluded the development of a new integrated coastal zone management plan, which has tried now to integrate climate change considerations in a more significant way into all the activities that we do, and also tried to look at disaster risk reduction in terms of how we can integrate that within the coastal management structure. So it's been pretty intensive over the last 8 years of the project that we were working on, which was the Coastal Risk Assessment and Management Program. But it has generated some new work for us, has been instrumental in helping us to move forward.
Now, Dr. Brewster, the establishment of the unit, I'm sure, was based on the changing weather patterns and their impacts on the Barbados coastline, and we see this right across the Caribbean. But can you just tell us what specifically prompted the start of this particular project in Barbados?
Okay, so way back in the early 80s, the government was receiving perpetual complaints from the tourism sector at the time about those properties noticing the narrowing of the starting of what they were thinking to be the narrowing of the beaches. That was the first call to action. And we had just come off also a series of pretty bad storms as well, but there was no real knowledge or understanding as to what was causing that problem. So the government went to the Intermarket Development Bank and got a small loan to start looking in a serious way at diagnosing what the problem was. And they identified such things as coastal water quality issues, reef degradation issues, the issues that then spoke also to coastal runoff from stormwater, and that potential impact leading to a reduction in sediment production from the reefs. And therefore, there was a greater concern then flagged in terms of not only how we should look to try and monitor beach changes over time, but more importantly, as time would progress, looking at what sort of other information would be essential for us to get a better understanding and appreciation as to what was happening along the coastline. So since then till now, we have systematically been working on data collection in various forms. So we've always collected beach profile data. We do over 120 beach profiles quarterly around our island. So that's like 120 beaches that we will be monitoring. We also look at matters that speak to collecting information on waves and currents to get a better understanding as to how that changes during the year, how the impact of swell waves during the winter season, which for us is from December to April, when we get a lot of long waves coming down from the North Atlantic when they have those winter storms that can lead to erosion of our beaches. And then also importantly, during the hurricane season, from usually from September when it's at its peak till about the end of November, which is a concern, even though the season can start from as early as late May or June, right? We also looked at other aspects of water quality monitoring. So we monitor about 15 locations, 15 reefs on a quarterly basis. And then we have a really intensive coral reef monitoring program that was started way back in 1982-83, where we now monitor about 50 reefs around the island every 5 years to try and pick up a trends in improvement or decline as a result of time passage, etc. And then we try to correlate that to maybe activities that are taking place along the coastline.
Now, in response to our rising coastlines, increased flooding, and stronger hurricanes, what are some of the adaptation techniques which Barbados has had to embrace?
So we have been looking at trying to integrate into our engineering designs climate change considerations. So we give consideration to increased storminess, increased wave energy that can impact on a coastline, as well as sea level rise predictions, right? Those are the basic ones that we would include. We've also therefore had to give greater consideration to how we try to harden our shoreline for protection. Now, some people may think that when you're hardening the shoreline, it would mean that you're just going to be putting up structures along the way, such as seawalls and groins and those sort of things. And what we have done is, yes, we've tried to use some of those in certain areas where beaches have maybe already been lost. But what we've also looked to do is we've looked to try to create new beaches in areas where there were beaches in the past, but over 50 years they had vanished. We've also tried to incorporate structures in their design that will still provide for lateral access along a coastline so the public and everyone else can still have access to use a beach space without it being a section of coastline that is cut off. We also try to ensure that any structures that we do will not negatively impact on the nearby ecosystems, which are predominantly fringing reefs. So that in essence, then what you have is that if you build a structure, you don't want a wave to be hitting it and putting sand onto the reefs themselves, right, in the backwash. So we try to do all that sort of engineering design along the way. And as a result, we've used things like offshore submerged breakwaters now in certain areas, especially in sandy bay areas, where you're well certain that the reefs are much further offshore. There's the ability for sand after a storm has passed to be a lot easily recovered by natural wave action back onto the beaches themselves, whereas in the past, it could have taken about 2 to 3 months for sand to recover. Using these submerged breakwaters close to the shoreline, it may be about 15 to 20 feet of water. We can see that sand returns was almost within like 6 weeks, right? In other areas where we're using seawalls, we also try to encourage the renourishment of those locations with sand, and then we will use short groins that slope into the water and are not surface piercing along their entire length, so that at the slope, as it goes into the water, you will then be able to still see sand bypassing over the top and around the front, so you don't get the traditional impact of the erosion on one side and the accretion on the other side of a groin. You're still getting that flow of sediment along the coastline. We try to also look to see how we can use the situation of using increased setbacks on properties that are within the shoreline fringe, so that if anybody wants to build, we have a 30-meter setback from high water mark, which is 100 feet, to try to ensure that you maximize that for any property being built, to take consideration for the potential for storm surge inundation during storms.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and then we've also tried to do some revegetation of sand dune systems and some beach areas as a means to assist with shoreline stabilization through those rooting systems of the plants to help reduce the impact of erosion from storm waves.
Now, as you mentioned earlier, Dr. Brewster, we are living in a world affected by climate change. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And of course, this conversation brings us to the subject of this episode, adaptation. Now, I'd like to know, and you can tell us, how serious is the need for us right now to adapt? And let me go further, especially for small island states. How critical is the need for us to adapt?
We have to definitely become more active in terms of how we look to pursue our individual resilience as island states to climate change, right? And it has to start more so at the individual level than say the broader government level. People have to recognize that this is a reality. It is a reality for small islands. It is a reality for all those persons who don't normally experience it. I mean, you have situations where tourists are traveling in the summer. They come down to any one of the islands in the Caribbean, and the likelihood that they may get a brush or touch of a hurricane impacting them where they are is very high. And it's only when they are there and they experience this sort of cataclysmic event that they then get to understand what we face on an annual basis. And I know the same would be true for in the Indian Ocean and South Pacific, etc. These realities, when these storms are coming through, are high. Our internal resilience is that we are able to rebound, and we rebound a lot faster than what people recognize. Okay, in the sense that we have become adapted to these sort of situations. And while we as individuals have to face the trauma of what has taken place, we try to integrate and build back better as we go forward. And I think that's something that we are all doing. But the reality of climate change cannot be taken lightly at all. It is something that must be recognized as a reality impacting us every day. Every day. We may not see like the vast differences in sea level rise within the Caribbean as what is occurring in the South Pacific, where you have places like Tuvalu and Vanuatu and those that are showing significant signs of erosion. And in some instances, some islands may be sinking, as in the case of the Maldives and maybe some of the other islands near the Seychelles. But at the same time, we have a situation where we recognize that because of sea level rise, the incipient inundation on our coast will lead to progressive beach erosion. And if the beaches are eroding ever so slightly every day, it means then that when we are going into our storm seasons, the natural buffer capacity of a beach for its shoreline protection as a natural resource ecosystem service is lost. And that is something that people don't recognize. The property owners and tourism people will notice that the beach may look narrower than last year when they were here. But at the same time, the reality is that this is what we're facing.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Brewster, for sharing your time with us, for sharing your expertise and giving us some great insight into the work of the unit and what is happening in Barbados so far as the whole issue of climate change is concerned and how you've been working to prevent the consequences and the impacts. So fine work that you've been doing. Congratulations and keep up the good work. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, and thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
We'll be right back after the break. Next, I have the honor of speaking with Celine Dyer, Climate Change Coordinator in the Cook Islands. Now, Celine has been at the forefront of adaptation in the Cook Islands and championing the importance of Indigenous knowledge in determining the magnitude of the threat of climate change. Her work has been well documented and celebrated, and now we have the absolute pleasure of speaking with her. Thanks, Celine, so much for being here.
Oh, and thank you, Andy, for that grand introduction.
Now, beyond the introduction that I just provided, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work in the Cook Islands?
Okay, first things first, Andy. I am a Cook Islander by birth and descent. Grew up and completed formal education in the Cook Islands. However, I had to travel to Australia to complete tertiary studies. At the moment, I work as the Climate Change Coordinator in the Climate Change Office of the Office of the Prime Minister and been in the role for just over 9 years.
9 years, huh? That's quite a time there. Well, I'm sure your interest and passion for climate science began long before that.
Oh, absolutely. I think growing up in such an environment, you're already connected to your surroundings, and you take those values as you grow up, and also in areas that you choose to work in. So those values are always with you, and you make decisions based on your values that you have grown up with.
Now, Celine, I feel like as islanders, there's a shared experience, there's a oneness between all of us. However, the experience for me growing up in Antigua, in the Caribbean, I'm sure was much different from your experience in the Cook Islands. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the Cook Islands.
Okay, well, just a bit more about the Cook Islands. There are 15 small islands in the Cook Islands, and it's divided into the Northern Group, consisting of 6 low-lying coral atoll islands, and the Southern Group, making up the rest of the islands with a mix of sand cays, raised coral, and volcanic islands. The Cook Islands is an ocean state surrounded by nearly 2 million square kilometers of Timona Nui or Kiwa, with a total land mass of only 236 square kilometers. Now, the population wise, according to our 2016 census, our total resident population was 14,600. But however, this would have drastically been reduced due to the COVID-19 migration to assist New Zealand farmers with fruit picking and freezing works. So we've had probably over 1,000 young people who have moved across to work in New Zealand over the last year of the COVID-19. And our spoken languages are, of course, Maori and English. Cook Islands is one of New Zealand's realm countries to New Zealand, and we hold our New Zealand passport as well. So we can travel back and forth to New Zealand and Australia. Most Cook Islanders, we are of Indigenous people of the Maori race,
Okay.
and we have our own culture, traditional knowledge, practices, and of course, our our native language is Maori. Our communities are mainly Indigenous Cook Islanders who have ownership of the islands and islands they live on. So you can imagine why people are passionate about protecting their islands and the livelihoods. And of course, each island has its own uniqueness in terms of dialect, practices, and local knowledge and stories. And the livelihoods of those in the Northern Group Islands, the low-lying islands, are mainly dependent on the ocean, whereas the Southern Group Islands are both land-based and ocean. And since the islands are widely scattered, you can also imagine the people's dependency on their surrounding environments for their livelihoods, because it may take about 4 days on the local boat to get from mainland Rarotonga to the one of the northern group islands, depending on the weather, of course.
Now, it seems like the citizens and residents of the Cook Islands are connected deeply to traditional values and very in touch with their environment. Is that the case? And tell us about some of those values.
Yeah, absolutely, Andy. And of course, I think also because of the small populations on each island, so people are more closely knitted together and they tend to help each other out and to care for each other. I think that's another aspect. That's why the communities are uh, close, closely related to each other and tend to um, hold on to their traditional values and local knowledge. Okay, for the Cook Islands, well known for still practicing our traditional conservation practices.
Okay.
And these conservation practices, and we've been doing as long as I can remember, so it's been passed down from our forefathers. Now, these conservation practices are mainly to allow for resources and natural systems to recover, for regrowth, and to multiply. It is also a source of emergency supply for times when communities are run out of food, or times of famine, or when struck by natural disasters.
Very interesting. So how long do these conservation practices actually last?
Now, certain places around the island may be put under conservation ranging from 6 months to a year or more, depending on the community. Mind you, this is community-based conservation. In some cases, some areas are designated under permanent conservation. Conservation practices also differ from island to island. For example, on one island, an entire islet may be put under conservation, meaning no one is allowed on the islet. Whereas on another island, it may be a certain fish or crop that people are not allowed to harvest, but may still harvest other resources within the area. And some islands are very serious about their conservation practices that every man and woman, once they turn 16, is assigned in the group that takes turns in guarding their entrance to the conservation area.
Okay, Celine. So what typically then drives these conservation practices to occur? I mean, are there specific events that have to happen in order to trigger a response like this?
Yeah, what has motivated these conservation practices is the resources on the island,
Mhm.
because the communities are aware that they are way isolated from mainland Rarotonga. And as I mentioned earlier, it may take 4 days for a boat to travel to reach one of these islands when they are short of supplies. So people are very particular how they take care of their resources on the island and how they allocate the resources and use their resources on each island.
Okay, so how has the perspective on climate change changed over time in the Cook Islands? And how has it changed across generations, if I may ask you that?
Well, it differs in each on each island.
Okay.
Um, for instance, some people are noticing the changes in their surroundings, such as the particularly from those low-lying islands, that they have noticed that the water level mark has moved further inland, and that shrubs and trees are standing in the water now, and they have to move their houses away from the shoreline. And in some cases, rows of mature coconut trees has gone underwater into the lagoon from the constant wave erosion and passing storm surges. And communities also noticed coral bleaching in the extent that clams also became bleached, which resulted in the overharvesting of this resource. And this was a few years ago, I think it was about 2016, 17, yeah, El Nino phase. On some islands, some agriculture areas has been abandoned to saltwater intrusion. So the communities are no longer planting in these areas because the water is now has gone saline and they're not able to plant their crops there. So these are the some of the current situations that people has alluded to us, and we have also seen them, and we have also confirmed these areas that the people have been telling us about.
Okay, Celine, clearly you're on the ground and moving among the community. Now, tell us, what are some of the concerns coming from community members?
I think the concerns coming from the most concerns that people are relating to is practically their immediate needs
Mhm.
in terms of the water, because the water holes are now undrinkable. So we have the communities have to resort to harvesting and storing water from rain. and also in terms of food security. So all these concerns in terms of the livelihoods of the communities. And of course, in these islands, there's no jobs, so the communities have to entirely depend on their ingenuity to create some sort of income for themselves.
No, as you've said, a lot of your knowledge about sustainable practices has been passed down to you from older generations, from generation to generation. So now, to what extent do you still use these traditions in your current practices?
Okay, so we cannot do away with what we already know, because that's who we are. That's why we are here today, because of what we already know and how we grew up. So I would say that even in today's world, society, this is where we mostly need these traditional knowledge and practices to inform us how we can plan or adapt in the future,
Mhm.
because because our traditional knowledge and local practices, they've been tested over time and they've been proven to work. So we should really continue on building on this existing knowledge that we have.
Okay, Celine, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for speaking with us, and all the very best in the future.
Oh, thank you, Andy, for your time. Much appreciated.
So we've gotten to hear from two different island voices about the varied techniques in adapting to climate change. One rooted in tradition, while the other is connected to a more modern approach. These methods are not disparate, however. So, how can we bridge the traditional and modern techniques? And what exactly does that bridging process look like? Obviously, we can't just abandon tradition and forget our roots. And as Dr. Brewster mentioned, obtaining the proper technology to adapt to climate change can be cumbersome and even expensive. So, in order to really make a difference, then we have to fuse the two methods for adaptation. Now, to answer some questions about the ethics of combining these two forms of knowledge, we have Dr. Dominique David Chavez. Dr. David Chavez is a professor of Indigenous Natural Resources at the Colorado State University. Her postdoctoral research analyzed indigenous ethics frameworks and federally funded research guidelines. Okay, Dr. David Chavez, before we begin, and let me ask you this. Could you just introduce yourself in your native language? And in doing so, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Mabrika, thank you so much for having me. So I will greet you, Mabrika, or welcome everyone listening in to, and Dominique Inaru David Chavez Diri. That's who I am, Boriken, Arawak, Hibaro Taino. That's my community in the Caribbean, and Hahom Guaitiao. So I'm thanking you and everyone listening in as extended relatives in our Island Arawakan or Taino language this way. I just think it's important to remember our Indigenous language and continue to learn and teach our children. So I wanted to share that. And it's something that draws us together. You know, in the Caribbean, we often think about our history by who colonized our islands and other parts of the small island nations too. But really we're like children who share the same mother, and we share the same mother language, and we share a lot across our communities. So that's something that I've been looking at in returning to my mother's home community in Boriken, or the island people might know as Puerto Rico, and some of our sister island communities. I've been working in multiple worlds as a climate scientist, as a scientist who studies and cares for the environment, and also as a community member, as a Indigenous person, looking at really our knowledge that we have that's been handed down generation to generation, our Indigenous and local knowledge, and how that can help us to care for the land, to care for each other, and to be resilient in terms of facing the impacts of climate change now and into the future. And there's a lot of different ways that I do that in my work that I'd love to talk about and share with you, depending on the interest of this podcast. But some of the work I do on island is what we're calling intergenerational climate research or community-based climate research that engages youth and elders and community members in the process. And I also collaborate nationally in the US and then internationally to learn across our communities about knowledge and strategies that can help us going forward. And just being on the community member side, early on, I realized that the way that scientists do the research, the process, how they conduct the research, may not always help our communities. Learning about it in college, the first generation of my family being in college, really paying attention. How do researchers come into community? Who's asking the questions? Who's gathering the data? Who's sharing the data and with whom? So a lot of my work has also been around what we call Indigenous research governance and data governance, or who holds authority over the data and what questions are asked. So that's kind of what I do in a nutshell right now.
I love it. Now, obviously, your community has an important relationship with the natural world. So, how do your people see environmental issues today?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you let us hear, because island people are born from resilience. We're all in one canoe. We're all on one island, and we have the resources at hand, the same ones our ancestors had that they cared for us. And so it's like everything about, the materials you use to build your home, the way you grow your crops, what crops you grow, everything originally was built for that resilience. We had concepts of sustainability before that was even a word, in academia and science. And so in our community, there's so many ways that, especially in the rural community, that people are being resilient and climate resilient, planting several different species of crops, paying close attention to the time of year, the type of soil, the water features on the land to determine what to plant and what to harvest and when, and where to build your home.
Yes.
Where not to build your home, where to keep the forests intact and the mangroves intact. These are all knowledges in our community and many other communities I'm finding across the Caribbean, across the world, that help us care for each other and for the land.
Okay, Dr. David Chavez, these days we rely on apps and weather prediction agencies to alert us about climate events. What are some methods, and you can tell us, that your people use to predict the weather and the climate?
The answer to both is yes, in short. It's been interesting, our traditional knowledge about indicators of change, of seasonal change, and like you said, what might be coming. So we have stories about if you're in the interior of the island and you see certain birds, seabirds, for example, a baguala is on the way, and that's an indigenous word, baguala, or a storm coming off of the sea. And there's so many, there are countless examples of indicators like this that especially rural folks depend on. Now, we all have access to our cell phone, And the real power that's happening today is when people are keeping the traditional knowledge, the keen observation, the ability to observe and pay attention to what the animals are doing, the atmospheric changes, also the moon, the phases of the moon and changes in the sky, paying attention to the sky, paying attention to the water. And there have been patterns. The earth has so many cycles of patterns. They call it, the scientific word is phenological change or seasonal change. People have a keen understanding of that. Now they're partnering that with the climate data that's being gathered by satellites and by, you know, on the ground meteorological instruments. There's a lot of power in using them together. It's very important that we don't disregard or make small of that traditional knowledge about those indicators and those stories that we have about, you know, like you said, when the dog barks. They're all points of that we should remain curious about. You know, they're all stories that were handed down for a purpose. So when we bring those together, we're really able to predict, have stronger prediction. There's lots of scientific studies about that now too. Your other question, yes, there's definitely, you know, both human documented through experience and instrument documented, you know, higher severity, higher frequency. The way the farmers talk about it is when it rains too much. When the heat comes, it's too much heat. They're describing climate, they're describing drought. People are experiencing, of course, extreme hurricane activity that is disrupting patterns among pollinators and different things that we haven't seen before. That knowledge, if you go back far enough, our people have been experiencing those extreme events for a long time. Even the word hurricane comes from huracan, from the island Arawakan language, the same language I introduced myself in. So we have understanding of the extreme events. We just need to remember far enough back also of how folks adapted and knew what was coming. But yes, times are different now in many ways.
Now, clearly, climate change is a major global issue. So what are some of the current challenges a community like yours is facing due to climate change?
There's two factors affecting the impact. One is definitely that closeness, that reliance. Anyone who is farming or fishing, fisherfolk for subsistence, of course, they're going to be impacted more severely by climate change. At the same time, also, our communities are more impacted because of our shared history of colonization, because our people have been displaced, because the rights have been oppressed, the knowledges have been oppressed. That also adds a challenge and a burden and a level of vulnerability that we have to address.
And how has your community actually adapted now to these challenges caused by climate change?
We're in the process of adapting now. You know, in some ways, for example, Hurricane Maria brought huge devastation. But at the same time, people talk about it as an awakening, as a forced awakening of a lot of people on island, because it became very clear where our greatest points of strength and resilience were and where our greatest vulnerabilities were. There's a movement right now, for example, of people moving towards smallholder farming or just growing food in land and community, recognizing how vulnerable we are when, you know, we're not importing what we need to sustain us. And there's a lot more push too, and this is something I support in my own work as an educator, for local people, Indigenous people, to enter into the sciences and into environmental management so they can assume those leadership roles and be able to make those decisions and policy and in management to care for their communities. They know what's needed more than anyone else because they grew up there and because their aunties and uncles, and cousins, their children are living there. So that has been one of the other means, long term for adapting and making those changes. But I think people are thinking very carefully too about if we're going to develop these coastlines, remove these mangroves, we're inviting flooding into the land here. We're not going to be able to live here and have our homes here. So really thinking about when we're planning our architecture, our development, that we're doing so with this long-term generational planning in mind.
Now, as mentioned earlier, Dr. David Chavez, we spoke with representatives of two methods of climate adaptation, one based in science and the other based in traditional knowledge. Now, are there benefits for bridging these two methods of adaptation?
Yes, and they complement each other when I think when we're sharing those same values and really thinking about that next generation, we have the greatest strength when we bring those different ways of knowing together. We do this intergenerational research. We think about the youth. I have 3 children. I think about my children all the time. We think about the youth and what are they going to need to face these challenges now and into the future. They're going to need all of the resources we can give them. They need the instrumentation, the technology, the climate model data that the satellites are gathering. So helpful for us. They also need that knowledge of people in community, our Indigenous science knowledge. How can we ensure that they have, both and all of those? I think that's going to help us.
I'm kept being reminded of a conversation that I've had with this young lady, just a teen, Okalani Marina from the Samoa Islands. Quite the advocate in terms of climate change. And I think it will probably become a permanent point of reference in terms of a story that she shared as to how, as a result of climate change, that her people's history, their stories, their culture can be lost. Is that a similar fear of yours?
The greatest threat has not been climate change itself. It has been colonization, which some would say is the biggest factor towards human-induced climate change. And I think it's important for us to, oftentimes we're looking at the symptoms, right, on the surface in terms of vulnerability. But when we follow those threads down to the root, for me, all threads return to colonization, colonial history, the values driving our economic structures, political and governing structures, and the way that we educate our children, the way that we educate our youth about what is important, what needs to be remembered. So it wasn't climate change in and of itself. It was these philosophical and value systems that have been, pushing these climate crisis forward. That has been the biggest threat to the loss of our knowledges, our languages, and the knowledge is embedded in our languages and our history. And the biggest reason for the displacement of our peoples. I think that the displacement of peoples from their lands, from their territories, from their languages that is really where the loss comes. And that intergenerational gap too, when youth don't have access to the elders in their community to learn from them, that is very quick way to erode, that history, that culture.
Okay, so we live in a world now where consent, representation, and inclusion is paramount for a movement to be effective. So, Dr. David Chavez, can you give us some examples of how indigenous practices have actually influenced science?
Oh, definitely. There's case studies all over the world now,
Uh-huh.
stories about this. And luckily, we're at a new era right now in terms of these high level scientific forum, these high level scientific institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and UNESCO, for example, the UN working groups are promoting the inclusion of local and indigenous peoples for climate adaptation and formally recognizing the importance of those knowledge systems, of those practices for scientific understanding and for planning as well. And that has helped to garner support. For example, in my own work for scientific studies, for research, where we are partnering with community members, with knowledge keepers to enhance our scientific understanding. The thing is that indigenous knowledge, it's not different, it's not separate from science or just, one other type of science. We're looking at thousands of different ways of knowing and understanding the earth. Thousands of different bodies of knowledge, and within each of those bodies of knowledge is scientific understanding, right? Because the farmers I work with, they have to understand everything about the soil, everything about the weather, everything about, precipitation, to know how to grow food effectively for their families. There's a lot at stake. So they're paying very close attention, they're testing, they're adapting, in the same way that we do the scientific method, where we test, refine, repeat, and learn and share what we learn, and from each generation to the next. So now scientists are starting to understand that there are these other threads of science too. Also, what we call science has always been informed by indigenous knowledges. If you read a lot of biographical accounts of scientists, they're like, oh yeah, there was this man, this woman from the community, they showed me where all the species were, I documented them and changed their name to my name, But there's indigenous knowledges has contributed to science, always, but without credit, usually, without any credit.
Okay, Dr. Dominique David Chavez, thank you so much for sharing your time with us. It was an absolute pleasure hearing about you and speaking to you, your profession, and the stories that hold your communities together. Continue the good work that you've been doing.
Home, thank you to you too for inviting me, and to everyone listening in. And I'm so excited we have this opportunity to share and learn from each other.
Hearing from these guests, we see that adaptation is necessary. Additionally, the methods for adaptation are not limited solely to modern or traditional techniques. Rather, there's a need to fuse the two and create something stronger. Therefore, we must adapt in a way which is ethical, practical, and effective. Tune in next week to hear about the justice that we as islanders seek and deserve from this climate crisis. I'll see you then. I'm your host for Islands on Alert, Andy Liebert. Islands on Alert is produced by Leila Henry and Louis Price under the Alliance of Small Island States media team. Special thanks to Tashwa James and Bianca Bedu for additional scripting. Join us next time.